This is the Manzanita Whippet, a performance steel gravel bike handmade by owner Jenson out of Reno, Nevada. It's fast, it's nimble, and it's pretty comfortable. In this video, a close look at this bike, including all the things that I like and dislike, with a special focus on the incredible attention to detail, which is something that you only really get from a custom frame builder like Nick. So Nick Jenson has been a frame builder since 2007, specializing in making custom steel bikes. He started Manzanita in 2019, and he's recently begun offering a couple of stock models as well. A do-it-all hardtail called the Manifesto, and this steel gravel bike called the Whippet. Now, even though it's a stock bike, the Whippet comes in 8 different sizes, which should cover the vast majority of rider heights and proportions. It's constructed from a combination of Columbus and Velospec steel tubing, along with some domestically sourced 4130 tubing. Now, it's not directly related to the bike, but one of the things that stood out to me right away is just how thorough the Manzanita website is. The tubing brand and even the budding profiles for each size is clearly displayed and openly transparent. And while some may be overwhelmed by the amount of information on the product page, I actually really appreciate it. I think someone who's going to invest in a high-end steel frame like the Whippet is likely a pretty discerning individual, so it makes sense to present as much information about the frame as possible. But I realize I'm already kind of in the weeds here, so let's zoom out and talk big picture for a minute. Now, the bike is designed around really wide tires, and every size can fit up to a 57mm or 2.25-inch tire. The smallest 3 sizes are designed around 650B, while the largest 5 sizes are designed around 700C. Now, one way companies try and save on manufacturing costs is to use the same rear triangle, or at least the same chainstays on all sizes, and then you just adjust the top tube and down tube to modify the stack and reach. With Nick's frames, pretty much everything is size specific, including the chainstays, which is actually nice to see. Without size specific chainstays, small sized bikes tend to feel longer for smaller riders, and it could result in a ride that's not as responsive as the designer intended. Now, this size M2 frame that I'm demoing here has short 420mm chainstays, which keeps the bike feeling really lively, but more on that in just a minute. Now, while the tube dimensions are all pretty different, the key geometric figures remain mostly constant throughout the lineup. All sizes feature a 70.5-degree head tube angle, and because they all use the same Sado carbon fork with the 53mm offset, all the 650B models have a trail of 67.5mm, corresponding to a mechanical trail of 63mm, and all 700C models have a 73.7mm trail, corresponding to a 70mm mechanical trail. And while we're talking about the fork, it's a tapered UD carbon fork by the company Sado, with 3-pack mounts that'll hold up to 4.5 kilograms or around 10 pounds, or it can accommodate a lowrider rack with a total capacity of 20 kilograms or about 44 pounds. Yeah, that's a lot. Now, the review bike I'm on here is a GRX 1x12 build with a White Industries crank and 40-tooth chainring paired to an XT wide-ranging 10 to 51-tooth cassette. The NV AG28 carbon wheels are paired with some chunky Rene Hurst Tandem Ridge 650B by 55mm tires in the Endurance casing. The finishing kit consists of NV carbon handlebars, an 80mm Cane Creek stem, and an Easton carbon seat post. The weight of this particular complete bike with no pedals or cages is 20.3 pounds or about 9.2 kilograms in size M2. Now, before I jump into all the little details that I think make this bike really stand out, I do want to just discuss how the bike rides. During the testing period, I put about 70 miles on the bike on terrain varying from flat roads to moderately chunky dirt descents. And over that time, a few things have stood out to me. Now, first is the ride quality. The regulars of this channel will know that I typically cringe at the phrase "steel is real" when used as a blanket statement about all steel bikes. Now, I'll go ahead and state it for the record. Not all steel is in fact real. A cheap steel frame that uses low-grade straight gauge tubing is going to be extremely heavy and ride pretty harsh. The Manzanita here, on the other hand, is definitely real. What's cool about the Whippet is that the butting profile of each tube is actually tuned to offer each particular size rider a similar experience. And for me, that experience has been a nice, smooth, damped feeling ride. I will say that the Whippet isn't as soft as some other steel frames that I've ridden, but it is nice and muted while somehow still feeling sharp and responsive. I know that kind of sounds oxymoronic, but it's really hard to describe and nearly impossible to quantify. Furthermore, as tires get bigger and squishier, it becomes even more challenging to tease out the frame compliance from the tire deflection. But I would argue that there is a difference between the spring rate of the tire and the springiness of the steel frame. It just gets a little bit trickier to pin down when the tires offer so much suspension. Overall though, the Whippet ride's really nice. It's exactly how I would expect a high-end steel frame to ride, if a touch on the stiff side. Now, if I compare this to the Ritchey Outback, which keep in mind is a completely different build, so it's not an apples to apples comparison, I would still say that the Whippet is just like one notch stiffer than the Outback. And keep in mind, a big part of that could very well be because the Whippet has 15mm shorter chainstays than the Outback. But again, that's just speculation. So those are my thoughts on sort of the ride feel. As far as the geometry and how it relates to the handling of the bike, well, let's just jump over to Bike Insights and take a look. In this comparison here, I'm looking at the Manzanita versus another bike that I spent a lot of time on, the Blackheart All-Road Aluminum. These two bikes are marketed very differently and they have very different aesthetics, but the geometry numbers are actually quite similar. The obvious difference is the much shorter seat tube on the Manzanita, which allows a lot more seat post to protrude, 190mm of seat post protrusion to be exact, and that certainly offers some additional compliance. But the stack and reach numbers are similar, the trail figure is the same, the chainstay length is also about the same, and the overall wheelbase, no surprise, is just about the same as well. Now when you look at the profile of the Whippet, the super sloped top tube gives it somewhat of a relaxed look. I would kind of assume like a progressive geometry, and generally pretty far from a traditional sort of racy bike with a horizontal top tube. However, much like the Blackheart, the Whippet actually has pretty quick and nimble geometry despite its relatively high trail figure. And that's one of the big takeaways that I've gathered from my time with the bike. Despite the chunky tires, the bike has a surprisingly racy feel to it. Super quick to accelerate and to change direction. So much in fact that it actually took me a little while longer than usual to get used to. On at least a few of the instances when plowing through some chunk, I found myself sort of bouncing around a little bit more than I'm used to, and I had somewhat of a harder time maintaining my chosen line. In a couple of instances, I actually felt the back end of the bike lift off as I kind of almost went over the handlebars, which is something that I almost never experience. The feedback that I got from the bike is that it really wanted to go fast, but I actually found myself backing off and feathering the brakes a little bit more than I'm used to. It's like the bike wanted to roll faster than I was comfortable with. Now, interestingly, the Specialized Crux that I've been riding a lot lately actually has a lower trail figure, which might suggest that it should feel even twitchier than the Manzanita, but somehow that's just not been the case. Honestly, I'm thinking it may very well be just the wheel diameter and have nothing at all to do with the frame. Now, I typically run 700C wheels and tires on all my gravel bikes, so it could just be that I'm not used to riding 650B. In any case, the bike rides really well. Even with the 55mm tires, the bike motors along the flats with pretty good speed. It climbs pretty well since it's not super heavy, and it also descends really well with the minor caveat that for me and my particular skill set, it did feel a touch on the twitchy side, but I would wager that a more competent cyclist would be able to manage the downhill chunk a lot better. It's definitely a comfortable bike to ride, and while I really want to attribute that mostly to the high quality steel and design, there's no arguing that the big tires and the 190mm of exposed seat post have something to do with it as well. So getting down to what I think makes this bike stand out from other steel frames on the market. Now for me, I think it's all in the details. The build quality for starters is just really good. Quality welds and a smart design overall. Again, Nick has been building frames for the better part of 20 years, which is a long time to be doing anything. The dropouts are a custom design of Nick's. They essentially future-proof the frame to some degree using these modular inserts, but they're designed in such a way that reduces shear stress on the mounting bolts. The dropouts are UDH compatible, and the non-drive side dropout and brake mount are all one piece, ensuring perfect perpendicular alignment that eliminates any weird brake issues. And then the cable routing was also definitely not an afterthought. The frame features appropriately sized cable guide bosses, which are smaller and more discreet than typical. It also features custom designed cable guides that are 3D printed and use a friction fit to eliminate the need for zip ties or cable clips. It's a pretty neat design, and any concern that I had that the cables would rattle loose dissipated over the first couple of rides. There's also a clever touch on the down tube where Nick has designed and printed a cable tunnel, we'll call it, that serves to protect the frame from rock chips, secure the cables in place, and because this particular mount uses standard M5 bolts, you can sort of neatly mount a water bottle on top. There's also a port on the back of the seat tube to run cabling for an internally routed dropper post, and in order to maximize tire clearance, Nick designed a custom chainstay yoke that's 3D printed from stainless steel and that tucks nicely between the tire and the chainring. Nick even provides all the STL files for the 3D printed guides on the website, so if yours ever break or become lost, you can just print some more at home. The website does say to print using PLA, which I personally wouldn't do if you ride in hot weather, as PLA is pretty susceptible to warpage due to heat, especially if under stress, as is the case when holding onto a length of housing. If it's me, I'd probably recommend printing in ABS or PETG just to improve the outdoor durability of the printed parts. Okay, so are there any things I didn't like about the bike? Not really. There is one thing, and I would call this a personal preference, is that maybe the top tube is just a little bit too slopey, but I definitely understood why Nick designed it this way. The sloped top tube allows for a lot of seat posts to be exposed, which actually does add to the compliance in the ride, but personally I think the top tube could just be a little bit less sloped. I'd also say something about the sizing just made this particular bike feel smaller than I'm used to. And the weird thing is that I sent Nick the fit numbers from my fit with the Ritchie Outback, and the Manzanita is basically set up to those numbers exactly. In other words, it should feel exactly the same as the Outback, but somehow it just feels a little bit smaller. Now my guess is that because even with the 650B by 55mm tires, the bottom bracket is still about 10mm lower than on, say, the Crux with 700C by 45mm tires. Or maybe it's just purely psychological and the bike just felt smaller due to the smaller wheels and the ability to really kind of throw the bike around with relatively little effort. Now, I suppose the big question is, who is this bike for? Well, in my opinion, it's for a full-blown bike nerd, for sure. Someone who appreciates an extreme attention to detail and wants to support a local frame builder who takes a huge amount of pride in his work. The Whippet probably isn't going to be somebody's first bike. It's more likely to be a forever bike purchased by someone who's already had a chance to ride many bikes over many years and understands the value of a simple, well-designed steel frame. I'd say the owner of the Manzanita Whippet is someone who values speed and comfort equally. That makes sense. And is willing to pay a premium for a steel frame designed and built by a frame building veteran. Ooh, that was a good sentence right there. All right, well, I think that's going to do it for this one. If you have any questions about my experience on the Whippet, just drop them down below. We'll do our best to get back to as many as we can. Thanks again for watching. Thanks for subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.